Earlier this month, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdoğan signed a decree to suspend Ankara's obligations under the Treaty on Conventional Armed Forces in Europe, known as the CFE. The treaty was signed in 1990 as the Soviet Union was beginning to unravel. It imposed limits on conventional military equipment in Europe, but Moscow withdrew from the agreement in November, saying it does not serve Russia's fundamental security interests. NATO countries, including the US, UK and Germany, followed by freezing their participation in the pact. Moscow had previously suspended its participation in the CFE in 2007 before completely withdrawing last year. Russia blamed NATO countries for fueling the Ukraine conflict and embracing Finland and Sweden as new members. Although the reciprocal response from the alliance came with condemnation, the US said the suspension of the treaty's obligations would strengthen NATO's deterrence and defense capacity by removing restrictions which affect military planning. Where does Turkey stand amid this change, and what impact will the CFE suspension have on European security? And for more on Turkey's suspension of the European arms restriction, joining me now from Brussels is Samuel Doveri Vesterbye. He is the Managing Director at the European Neighbourhood Council. And from Ankara, Tudor Onea, an assistant professor at Bilkent University. A warm welcome to you both, and thanks for joining me on Strait Talk. So, Tudor, back in October 2023, Turkey, along with other NATO allies, voiced regret over Russia's withdrawal from the specific treaty. And now Turkey has suspended its obligations under this treaty, which is also called CFE. So what has changed from Ankara's perspective?
It's not a question of, this was about to happen, and it is very likely that this is something that, most NATO members will undertake in the near future. Poland has done so already, and Turkey would be the second country in NATO that does it.
So, following Russia's, initial decision to withdraw from it, as we've just mentioned, several NATO countries had also announced the formal suspension of this treaty. So how have power balances changed in Europe in the past few years, and what are we looking at right now?
Well, I think it's important to contextualize the Conventional Armed Forces in Europe Treaty, the CFE, as you mentioned. This was an initiative after the Cold War to create confidence in order to lower the amount of armament, tanks, helicopters, and many other military equipment along the so-called ex-Warsaw Pact and the NATO countries. Russia essentially acted quite belligerently, suspended already in the early 2000s its membership, and as you mentioned, recently pulled out. How does that change the balance or the equation between so-called East and West? Well, it puts Turkey in a very difficult position. And of course, Turkey needs to secure its own national interests. And now that Russia has left the treaty, it's only natural that Turkey does the same.
So, Tudor, the US said the suspension of the treaty's obligations would strengthen NATO's deterrence and military capabilities. So is it really the case? And where does this leave NATO member Turkey, which also has close strategic relations with Russia?
Well, this was bound to happen for a very simple reason that, and by the way, we should know that, Russia has suspended its participation in the treaty in 2007, and it withdrew, if I remember correctly, in 2015. So the question here was when NATO was going to follow suit, and this is pretty much a legal move in order for NATO to allow NATO to essentially rearm and deploy forces in Europe. Now, we should know one thing that we should note is that suspension doesn't necessarily mean that the treaty has disappeared, and that it has been terminated, or it doesn't mean that the provisions of the treaty have been renegotiated. It's simply that for a temporary interval, the respective country chooses not to respect its obligations. And this, in fact, what the CFE was doing was to put ceilings on a number of armaments, such as tanks, helicopters, fighter jets, etc., that a country could deploy in Europe. Now, these limits have been suspended, and essentially this means that with the respective countries of NATO, because this is done as a bloc, are able to now increase their armed forces.
But I mean, all these decisions, as you've just mentioned, are reversible. But do you believe is there a room and a need for that under today's political landscape?
Not today, but sooner or later, a new security architecture will have to be devised. This treaty was, we should remember, this was signed in 1990 when NATO was essentially 16 countries. Now it is double that number.
Yes.
And so essentially, also this was done block to block. So it wasn't done by country or by region or by area. And therefore, it required updating in any case.
Yes.
So when this is going, to be over, sooner or later, the great powers and also that the other NATO members will have to sit at the table and talk about new terms.
So, Samuel, could these withdrawals be construed as part of some European efforts to form its strategic autonomy away from the United States? And how will the European security architecture will be impacted?
I think that the Turkish suspension or withdrawal is indicative of its geographic position, in the same way that Poland is also in a vulnerable position vis-a-vis Russia. And Russia has increasingly showed a very aggressive regional attitude or policies, as we've seen with not respecting the national sovereignty of Ukraine. And at the same time, Russia is very suspicious of Turkiye's role and work in the Caucasus and in Central Asia. And also, of course, both countries are very, very nearby one another. And as a result, I think that kind of dynamic is what's really driving Turkey's withdrawal from the treaty. Now, with regards to European defense and security, I would primarily categorize this under a NATO umbrella, in the sense that Turkey is the second largest army in NATO. And I think at the moment, with regards to the withdrawal of the treaty, it's primarily a national security issue for Turkey that probably starts feeling threatened on its borders.
So, Tudor, with the implementation of the treaty becoming impossible in practice, how would retaining transparency, balance and predictability among military forces play out moving forward?
You mean between NATO and Russia?
Also
right
from
now,
Russia's perspective, of course.
Well, right now, I mean, this is really worrisome because it takes us one step further to dismantling every arms control treaty that we have. The ABM has been terminated. Essentially, the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty has been terminated. This treaty is pretty much in its, if it's not dead, it's in its death throes. So it looks bad. So what is coming is essentially an arms race between NATO and Russia. We know that, I mean, we don't know exactly how much Russia was affected, how much of its military equipment was destroyed and will continue to be destroyed in the war with Ukraine. But of course, there is the high likelihood that in the aftermath of the war, Russia will rebuild. And of course, we are going to see a competition with NATO. So in this competition, Turkey, as you know, the other guest has mentioned, is going to play a very important role as one of the largest armies of the alliance.
So, Samuel, the treaty seems to have become redundant and the post-Cold War era is over. What kind of a new order is emerging right now? I mean, how would you define it?
History has a tendency to be cyclical. The current moment that we're living is probably highest reminiscence of the 1940s and 1950s, the so-called first period of the Cold War, where there was the Korean War, where there was the build-up to the Cuban Missile Crisis, and where there was the highest level of animosity between so-called East and West, or for the lack of a better word. And so I think we can easily define the period we're living in right now, both when we look at the abandonment of treaties as the other guest mentioned, the increase in the arms race and the general suspicion on all sides as a starting or the first phase of the Cold War. Fortunately, history tells us that the next phase is the so-called détente, where we start rebuilding trust and there is more stability. But it's not there right now.
All right, gentlemen, we'll have to leave it here. Thank you very much for joining me on Strait Talk.